This Week in Agribusiness, serving America's most essential industry, is brought to you by Case IH.
Coming up on This Week in Agribusiness, grain shippers grow concerned about water levels in the nation's inland waterways. Hello everyone, thanks for joining us for This Week in Agribusiness. I'm Mike Pearson in the studio this week, but we will be joined by Max Armstrong here in a little bit. Before we do, however, it's deja vu for growers up and down the river system in the nation's midsection. Water levels are low, lower than they were heading into harvest of last year. That's driving some changes in the economics for river shippers. Joining us now to talk about it is Mike Steenhoek, the Executive Director of the Soy Transportation Coalition. And Mike, thanks for joining us this week.
Hey, it's good to be with you, Mike. Thanks for having me.
If you would, kind of set us up with how river levels look in September of this year compared to just 1 year ago, September of 2022.
Well, it's a movie sequel none of us want to watch. When you look at water levels this year compared to the same period last year in places like St. Louis, we're about 4 feet lower on this date than we were the same date last year. Memphis, about 4.5 feet lower. And again, last year we experienced historically low water levels, so it's clearly a cause for concern when we're actually lower at this point. And this is the time where we're increasingly into harvest season, which is game time when it comes to agriculture. It's really critical to have our supply chain operating at full throttle, and unfortunately that is not occurring. So it clearly is a cause for concern.
It certainly is. And Mike, you mentioned last year, the entire last winter, we saw the Army Corps of Engineers dealing with that record or historic low water level. Did they make some long-range improvements that have improved transportation for this year's low water level?
Well, we are seeing some real good evidence that, the Corps of Engineers, one of their resolutions from last year, even though they worked very diligently on dredging throughout the inland waterway system, particularly the Mississippi River, was better to get on the front end of it if such an event ever occurs again. The best time to respond to a challenge is actually before the challenge rather than after the challenge. And so we are seeing some really good dredging activity by the Corps of Engineers. Obviously, the solution to this problem is precipitation. The cause of it is lack of precipitation. But there are things you can do, and dredging is a good example of that, to maybe take the edge off it a little bit. And so we're fortunately seeing that, and we commend the Corps for their activity.
Glad to hear some progress is being made there, Mike. But in the meantime, I understand we are seeing some restrictions put on loading in these barges. Is that something is pretty common up and down the system?
Yeah, when you have low water conditions like this, and we experienced it last year, the river doesn't normally behave this way. What we have seen it these last couple of years is it impacts barge transportation in two ways: channel depth and channel width. And with a lower water levels on the river, you can't put as much freight, in our case soybeans and grain, in each barge because you're concerned that it'll actually scrape the bottom and maybe experience a grounding. So that's channel depth, but then also channel width. With less water, the shoreline becomes more evident. The shipping channel narrows. So it's kind of like going from a 6-lane highway down to 3 lanes or 2 lanes. And so you can't put as many barges together and attach them to form one single unit. So when you put those two things together, lack of channel depth, lack of channel width, it really does impede the economics of barge transportation.
And those economics are changing, Mike. I understand with these restrictions, higher prices are coming as well. Can you give us an indication as to what you've seen so far?
Yeah, we track, the cost of loading a barge at various spots throughout the river. The U.S. Department of Agriculture does a good job posting those rates. In St. Louis, for a ton being loaded at that area, we're 77% higher than the 3-year average. If you're loading a ton of freight in the Memphis area, 91% higher than the 3-year average. And one of the unfortunate things about agriculture is when you've got a cost escalator in transportation, those costs are disproportionately passed on to the farmer in the form of a lower price that farmer receives at point of sale, or their basis gets more wide or negative. So farmers are the ones that pay the cost of that, unfortunately.
They certainly are. Hopefully those farmers throughout the Corn Belt will start to see some moisture even as they work to get harvest in, and we can keep that river level rising. It's Mike Steenhoek, the Executive Director of the Soy Transportation Coalition.